It's been our joy here at Gateway during Labor Day weekends to highlight someone who serves the Lord in a unique vocation. We have always wanted here at Gateway for everyone's calling, whatever that may be, to be lifted up. And we kind of say this, that whether you're whether you're a lawyer, or whether you're a doctor, or whether you work in roofing, or whether you're an administrator, or whether you're a teacher, or whatever you might be, you're a disciple of Jesus Christ. In other words, you're a disciple of Jesus Christ cleverly disguised as a lawyer. Or you're a disciple of Jesus Christ cleverly disguised as a doctor, or cleverly disguised as a school administrator, or cleverly disguised as a business person. You're a disciple of Jesus. And last year I had an opportunity to have Jeff Sladko in my class at Multnomah, and I got to know him and appreciated him, and I want to share a little bit about him before he comes and speaks to us. Jeff grew up in Talent, Oregon, and he graduated from the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs in 1987. He attended Air Force pilot training in Columbus, Mississippi, and was assigned to fly the Boeing KC-135A Stratomaker at Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan. And during this assignment, he flew his first mission in support of Operation Desert Shield. Shortly thereafter, he was reassigned to the Ellison Air Force Base in Alaska outside Fairbanks, where he flew reconnaissance missions in an RC-135SX Cobra Ball. Boy, that sounds cool. That sounds cool. And Cobra I, monitoring the Soviet-Russian strategic missile testing activities. He was then transferred to Kadena Air Force Base in Japan, where he flew the KC-135R Stratomaker. It's during this assignment that he married Linda, his wife of 24 years. She couldn't be here. She's in Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, with her son, and they're rafting in the Czech Republic. Can you believe it? There's rafting in the Czech Republic. How about that? So we might have to have a trip over there to... Upon returning to the United States, Jeff and Linda left for active duty Air Force and moved back to Fairbanks, where he worked in the Alaska Air National Guard. In the fall of '97, he was hired by Continental Airlines to fly the MD-80, and the next summer, Jeff and Linda and their 2-month-old son, Jonathan, drove from Houston, Texas, where they lived, until September 11th, 2001. Remember that? His Guard unit in Alaska brought him back on active duty to support Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan and subsequently Operation Iraqi Freedom in Iraq. They moved, and his family, which now included a 10-month-old, back to Fairbanks for the third time. Jeff and his family stayed in Alaska for the next 15 years. Their third child, Nicholas, was born in 2003, and the family moved from Fairbanks to Eagle River near Anchorage, where Jeff flew the McDonnell Douglas C-17 Globemaster. When Jeff finally retired as lieutenant colonel, he had accumulated 7,000 flight hours, including over 250 hours in combat missions in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan over his career of 32 years. We're safe. We're safe. During the merger of the Continental Airlines and United Airlines, he was a 757 and 767 captain and was transferred to the Boeing 787 Dreamliner as first officer in 2014, which he continues to fly today. Jeff flies 3 weeks every month, right? And leaves on Wednesday, flies to Australia, and then flies back, and just got back here yesterday from Australia. So, in fact, I was texting him, beautiful. I was texting him over Friday, and he was texting me from Australia. Isn't that amazing that you can text somebody in Australia? That's amazing. So, anyway, he attended Multnomah Biblical Seminary to just continue to grow, and he graduated early this year as in magna cum laude as a master's in Christian leadership. So Jeff and his wife Linda lead a college career group at their church, Brush Prairie Baptist, which meets weekly at their home and have recently begun a ministry developing community among the young people there. They're also active in several Josiah ventures, mission trips to youth to Central and Eastern Europe, and primarily the Czech Republic and mostly to Eastern Germany. So Jeff is very, very active. So they have Jonathan, 21, Katrina, 18, and Nicholas, 16. And they like camping and playing video games that shoot down Russians. And no, that's not true. That was my addition. Sorry. That's not true. That was bad of me. Russia's a wonderful group of people. So they really are. Anyway, I shouldn't have put that in there. And hiking and enjoying beautiful Pacific Northwest. So anyway, Jeff, thanks for coming and sharing. He's going to share his testimony with us, and he's going to share a little bit about himself. So Jeff, come share.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. It's an interesting weekend, and Labor Day is kind of an unusual thing for us in the United States. I don't know if you know this, but the United States is the only country in the world that celebrates something exactly like we do. There are many other countries celebrate something on May 1st. That's kind of an International Workers' Day, but it's not really the same. Our Labor Day has some interesting roots, and so I thought I'd start my story with a little bit of the background about what this day is about, because if you're like me, you don't really know. So Labor Day started back in the 1800s during the height of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. According to the History Channel, in the late 1800s, it took 6 to 7 days a week of work for at least 12 hours a day to earn even the most basic living. Despite restrictions in some states, children as young as 5 or 6 years old in many cases were working, in many cases forced to work in factories, in mines, and mills. They earned a fraction of what their adult counterparts in the same jobs earned. People of all ages, and particularly poor and immigrants, often faced extremely difficult circumstances in their working environments. In some cases, they didn't even have access to simple basics like fresh air, water, or a place to take a break. As manufacturing increasingly replaced agriculture as the source of American employment, labor unions began to grow and develop. And it wasn't long before the labor unions were able to have enough strength to renegotiate some of the working conditions that those people were working in. The idea of a workman's holiday kind of started to take off, and interestingly, it was Oregon State that first instituted a state legal holiday, February 21st, 1887. They gave the state's workers a free pass to not come to work for one day. Interestingly, they didn't give them Monday, they gave them Saturday. 12 years later, though, the federal government decided Monday would be better because we like our long weekends. Speaking of long weekends, it's interesting that we have this one in September. When you think about it, every other month of the year has some holiday in it. But all of those other holidays are not about the regular worker. They're all about a person or some religious event. Let's think about it. January, MLK Day, Martin Luther King. February, President's Day. That used to be, when I was a little kid, it was Washington's birthday and Lincoln's birthday, and we got 2 days off that week. But the government helped us figure that out and gave us one instead. March, St. Patrick's Day. April has Easter, usually. May has Mother's Day. June has Father's Day. July has Independence Day. August has my birthday. They haven't quite gotten to making that a federal holiday yet, but we're working on that. November, Veterans Day and Thanksgiving, Christmas in December, but September is unique because it's about people. So, Labor. What do you think about labor? Some of you, your view of labor may be a little bit based on what job you have right now. You might really like labor because you love your job. Or you may think, this is an evil that I have to get through till I get to the holiday. Your view of labor might be based on your residential status. If you're a dreamer or an illegal alien, you may have a different view of labor than someone who's a citizen. It may be based on your economic status. If you're extremely well off, you may think of labor completely differently than if you struggle to make the ends meet every single month. But what was work or labor, and those two words I'll use interchangeably today, what was it all about originally? If we think about it, back in Genesis, all the way back at the very beginning, God created Adam, and he gave him an assignment. He gave him a job. Now, those of you that think labor, kind of maybe that was because of the fall, and we shouldn't really have to do that, think about this. Adam's first 3 jobs were given to him before Eve even showed up, let alone before sin. What were those jobs? Well, the first one was what? No, that wasn't the first one. What's the first job Adam? What was it? Yeah, he was a gardener. That was his first job, was tend the garden. Naked gardening. It was the first time it had ever been done. Gardener and groundskeeper. The very first job ever assigned to any human. After gardener and after groundskeeper, that's when he became a zoologist and named every animal. Now, some people think he named them things like elephant and gopher and eagle. I think he named them Bob and Sam and Jim. I'm not sure. It's just my view on that. But the work wasn't about the work producing per se. Think about this. When you go to work, and I go to work. I go to work because I get a paycheck. Now, I really like my job. But I do it because I get a paycheck at the end of the month. And I can do all kinds of things with that paycheck. I can feed my family. I can pay my mortgage. I can give to my church. I can send my wife to the Czech Republic. But that's not what Adam's work was about. It's not what our work really is about. You see, our work is a part of our design. It's part of what God put in us as a created purpose. There were very specific vocations that Adam was given, and there are very specific vocations that you're given. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to find your specific one. I don't know how many college-age 20-somethings there are in here, but there's definitely a trend in that year group to be fearful about what the future holds. Trying to decide, should I go to school, should I not? If I do go to school, what school should I go to? What job should I have? Should I work in social justice? Should I work in manufacturing? Should I become a police officer or a pilot? There's a lot of fear. And let me tell you what I tell them. Don't worry. God's got this. He created you with a purpose. And He's going to work in you to make sure that purpose is accomplished. Now, I want to sort of talk to you today about what I'm going to call the 4 C's of Christian work. I know Tom likes alliteration, so I decided to try and make you feel a little at home. The first C is creation. I'll talk about that some more in a minute. The next C is commission. We've heard this morning, actually, the word commission, but a lot of us don't know what it is, really, so I'm going to tell you about what a commission is and how that works. The next C is calling. We hear a lot about calling. In fact, Tom asked me to come talk to you today about how my Christian faith affects my calling as a pilot. Now, it may sound to you a little weird. Maybe Tom uses that terminology all the time here. I don't know, but it sounds a little strange to us often to hear somebody in a regular old vocation be spoken of as one who is called to it. We're going to mention some things about that, and I'm going to wrap up with consecration. What do we do with all this stuff that God's given us? And how does that change who we are and how we relate to the world? So, creation. I mentioned in Genesis, God created heaven and earth. He created man, and he gave us a very specific role, a piece of work to do in that creation. Now, we don't want to spend too much time thinking about this because that's not where God wants our focus. But it is good to help us see where we're going when we get up in the morning. As I mentioned, there was no mention in Genesis for Adam's assignment about how much money he could make, whether he gave an offering or a tithe back to God from what he did. No, it was the intrinsic value of the work itself that made it valuable. It was the fact that Adam was doing something he was designed to do that made the doing of it the point. God didn't really need a gardener when you think about it, right? He created the whole earth in the first place. But he designed Adam to be one. God didn't really need somebody to go name all the animals. He already knew their names. But he designed Adam with the capacity to do that and with the direction to do it. God doesn't really need me to be a pilot. If I wasn't here, somebody else would certainly take my place. If there was no such thing as pilots, people would still make their way around the country in some way, whether it was in a covered wagon or an old VW Bug, or however it is that we got across the country, we would do it. Now, the fact that I can fly to Australia in 16 hours from Los Angeles makes it somewhat unique, but really today we're accustomed to that, aren't we? My wife said, I'd like to go to the Czech Republic and take this trip with some friends of ours, some of who are unbelievers. And I said, yeah, go ahead. We can do that. But it's not what I give back. When I tithe, when I give to the offering, it's the work itself, because that's what God made me. He made me, he created me to be a pilot. I was created to fly airplanes. Crazy. I was also created to do a lot of other things, but a part of what I was created for enables my community and my world to be a better place. When you want to go see your ailing mother or your kids in college, or when you want to get away from your kids in college, or when you want to go see the Grand Canyon, or whatever you want to do, you can do that because of what I do. But again, yes, I contribute to my community. Yes, I contribute to the community, but it's not the community's contribution that makes what I do valuable. I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. Ultimately, my work is valuable because it's God who assigned it to me. It's my Creator who assigned it to me. My faith makes me the ideal candidate to do this job. Because he created me, I trust him for it, and there's two reasons. Not only is it just the work, but it's also the people. Tom mentioned you may be a pilot cleverly disguised as a disciple or a witness. You see, witness is what we're here for, isn't it? Have you ever wondered why when you pray that prayer of offering your life to Christ for the very first time, why you don't instantly go to heaven? Why does he leave us here? This place is not really all that great when you think about it. There's pains and injustice in the world. There's lost people who are kind of hard to get along with. There's disease. There's wars. Why do we stay here? It's because God wants us to be in contact with those people who need to hear about him. and we are in contact when we're doing the job that God has given us to do. You see, I come in contact with people that Pastor Shive will never see. I come in contact with flight attendants. I come in contact with gate agents. I come in contact with passengers. People you'll never see. The guys that put the fuel on the airplane and the guys that throw your bag underneath, hopefully in the baggage bin. But it's my faith that makes me ideally suited to do the job that He gave me. So I was created, that's the first C, I was created to do the work God gave me to do. And if you're wondering at all if this is still really applying, even though, yeah, okay, Adam, that was back in the Old Testament, creation, things have changed a little bit. Well, look at Ephesians 2:10. What does Ephesians 2:10 say? It says that we are His workmanship, the same words that describe Adam. Just like Adam, we are His workmanship. And we're created to do good works that He, Jesus, prepared beforehand for us to do. This isn't new, and it's not old. It's current. Now, we've used the word commission before. I have a job, that's my title, is first officer right now on a 787. But what is this thing called commission? We hear it in church. If you have a military background, you might have heard about people being commissioned. It's about your view of yourself and your relationship to authority. That's what commission is. You see, if you see your work as a designed-in purpose that you were created to do, it changes things. If you're using your time to do the work that God created you to do, whether you have a title like pilot, or maybe you have a title like housewife, maybe your title is something like unemployed. Maybe your title is something like homeless. You're not excused from the requirement to do the job that God designed you to do. It's not employment that He's talking about, it's being. That's what commission is. You see, let me put some context on this. When I was in the Air Force, I was commissioned. I was given a big piece of paper. I actually got it out this weekend and read it again. It was back in the 80s, and so President Reagan was in office. President Reagan wrote to me on that piece of paper that he signed, and it said that I was in part to carefully and diligently discharge the duties of the office to which I was appointed. That was the first thing. It goes on to quote the president. He said, "And I do strictly charge those officers of personnel of lesser rank to render such obedience as is due an officer of this grade and position. And that this officer is to observe and follow such orders and directions from time to time as may be given by the President of the United States or other officers senior to him acting in accordance with the laws of the United States." That's kind of fluffy language. What's it really mean? Well, what it really means is I was commanded to do two things. One, discharge the duties, whatever they were, that I was given. And number two, to obey the authorities over me. My subordinates were also charged to obey me because I had the authority of the President of the United States riding on my shoulders. That's what a commission is. It's a transfer of authority, a delegation of authority from one who has it to one who gets it. As a Christian, our commission is declared as well, just like mine was from the President. If we look in Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, it's a fairly well-known passage of Scripture, and it's called the Great Commission usually. What happens in the Great Commission? Well, this is Jesus talking. It's at the very end of his time on earth. And he says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. That's pretty universal. All authority. He said, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Jesus specifically states the authority that he has to give me a commission, and you. And then he tells them, the disciples, what they're going to do for the rest of their earthly lives. Now, it's really easy to read that and think that was the commission for those 11 guys that were listening to Jesus' words that day. But it applies to us. And if you're not sure about that, look at Jesus' last words there in that last sentence. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. To the very last day before Jesus comes back, he is with us, and we're commissioned, each one of us, to do the work that he created in advance for us to do. For me, that includes flying airplanes. For you, it might include cleaning the kitchen, driving a truck, packing pickles. I don't know. It could be anything, or it could be nothing. Let me ask you about this. Is that commission only for people with a job? Mm-mm. Is it only for people that are mentally strong? Or can it include people with dementia? Can it include people that are shut in? I understand that we have some shut-ins listening to us right now. You're not exempt either. Each one of us is to do the work that God has given us. Now, this work, this word is a little interesting here. What if the work that God has given you today is to be in need? Have you ever thought about that? It might be that what your best work is to be served at times. Maybe you're retired. I'm retired from the military, but I'm still working. Maybe you're really retired, unlike me, and you're done with your work. The commission applies to you as well. Because it isn't about your employment, it's about who you are. And that leads me to this idea of calling. Commission is about authority and about obedience. It's very general. Tom called it the 30,000-foot overlook in the book you have in the back. That's kind of what we're doing today. But now I'm going to focus in a little bit. What's your calling? This calling is an interesting word. After I was commissioned, that is, I was given a command to obey and authority to obey, the next thing that happened to me in the military was I was given orders to a place called Columbus, Mississippi, which I'd never heard of up until that point. It's a little teeny tiny town in deepest South. The South's an amazing place. I actually asked to go there because I'd never experienced anything like living in the South, and I never have since. If you've ever lived there, you know it's a whole other country. I was assigned a vocation, go learn to fly airplanes. That's essentially what they said. In the New Testament, we have this word, calling. It means something like an invitation or an offer to enter into the benefits of something. In the military, we call it an order. That's a little more gruff sounding, but it's the same idea. You see, just like my military orders, I could have disobeyed them, but it would have had grave consequences and very rapid ones. Funny how that's just the same as with God. Our calling can be disobeyed, but there will be consequences. There always are. So my calling was to be a pilot. In the Christian life, the commission is to carry authority, and to obey. The calling is about how you do that. In Romans 11:29, we're told that the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. You can't change your mind. In fact, you don't get a choice on what your calling is exactly. God has that all sort of pre-worked out for you. But you don't get to say, I don't want to do my calling. I don't want to be making disciples anymore. I don't want to be baptizing or teaching people. That's not one of the choices. And wherever you are, you may change jobs. I may stop being a pilot and start being a preacher, although after today, probably not. Paul urges us in Ephesians 4:1 to walk worthy. Walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. In fact, I won't, but I could read all of Ephesians 4, and that entire chapter is all about what our calling should look like. It all boils down to this central concept of unity in Christ for the sake of letting the world know that Jesus loves them. Isn't that amazing? This body here this morning, each of you have different talents, different gifts, different abilities. You have different jobs. Some of you are retired. Some of you haven't even started working yet. But whoever you are and whatever you do, you have a commission. You have authority from God to do the things that He's called you to do. And you have a calling. Now, some people are really concerned. Those young people that I mentioned, they're really concerned about finding their calling. What I tell people in that age, and I work with lots of them, is stop worrying and start doing something. As you begin walking in life, you'll discover things that you never knew. If you're like me, you're going to be in your 50s and you're going to go, wow, there's a whole nother world out there that I never knew existed. Maybe when I reach my 80s, I'm going to go, man, there's a whole other world out here. My daughter, who's 18 and getting ready to start college, told me, I don't know what to major in. And I said, well, what are you interested in? And she said, everything. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a concert violinist. I want to build prosthetic devices for people that are amputees. And I said, whoa, slow down. You only get 70 or 80 years. She goes, I know, it's not enough time. It's not, but guess what? We get eternity with God. If you're 80, 90, 100 years old, you're just getting started. Think about that. I know I am. Our calling, my calling, makes my faith in Jesus what makes me the ideal candidate to do the job that I have. How does my Christian walk integrate with my faith and my calling as a pilot? It's because I am able to do the things that I do, that I'm able to brush up against the people that I brush up against, that I have the experiences and crazy stories that I tell people about flying. All of those things are part of who God made me, so that I can do what He called me to do. You have crazy stories. You have histories. You have experiences that people go, wow, they used to do that? They used to have 2 holidays in 1 week for presidents? Yeah. But let me tell you something else. We call religious workers called. That's how we typically use the term in churches. So Pastor Shive called to be a pastor. The missionaries you were praying for called to be missionaries. In some way, we think of them as sort of superheroes, right? They're sort of the Marvel characters of real life. We regular people just have a regular job. I go to work 9 to 5. I come home. I make dinner. I wash the dishes. I get the kids to bed, and then I go to bed. That's no calling. No, it is a calling. If you have children, you have a calling. If you have grown children, you have an even bigger calling. If you know other people, you have a calling. If you're a shut-in and you can't leave your bed, but somebody comes to take care of you, you have a calling. If If you're mentally handicapped, if you're physically handicapped, if you're homeless, you have a calling. If you're a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, you have a calling. Every single one of us does. It may not be to be a pilot like mine, but every one of us has a calling that has to do with who we are and how we relate to each other in the church so that the love of God is shared in all the world. Why did Jesus tell us to love each other in the church? So that the world may know that we are his disciples. So our calling, my faith in Jesus makes me the ideal witness in the sphere of influence that he put me in. Consecration. What is consecration? It's really the idea of setting apart, making holy, making something, giving something a special purpose. And here's where I'm going to get personal. My identity as a pilot makes me view the world in a certain way. Your identity as a housewife or a CEO or a person of color living in Portland or an unemployed man living on the side of the 205. Whatever you see yourself as creates your view of the world. And it's your view, your identity, that colors in every way the way you see your calling. Let me ask you this. If I walk up to you and say, "Hi, my name's Jeff, yours is Jim. Hi, Jim. What do you do? Or who are you?" You might tell me your occupation or what you did if you're retired. You might tell me the things that you do as hobbies. You might tell me your political affiliation, your favorite newspaper to read. You might tell me your sin, if we know each other well. We tend to identify with our sin, don't we? Yeah, and we fill in a word that makes us feel shame. In a group this big, statistically, there's somewhere between 30 and 50 men in here who struggle with pornography or sexual addictions of some kind. There's somewhere between 10 and 20 of you in here that struggle with alcoholism or drug abuse. Do you identify with that? Do you say, "I'm a alcoholic"? Maybe you say, "I'm a recovering alcoholic." Jesus has some things to say to us about our identity. 1 Corinthians 6:9. Paul gives a list of sins. I'm not going to read them all, but you can read them there if you want. He's pointing out to the Corinthians all the sins, not all of them, a subset of all the sins that the Corinthians were actively engaged in at the time. And he says, "Such were some of you." He's talking to the Christians in Corinth. "But you were washed. You were sanctified." Very similar word to consecrated, but it starts with an S, so I couldn't use it. You were set apart, and you were made a child of God. A child of God. God, once you become a believer, does not identify you with your sin. You know why? Because that sin was nailed to the cross 2,000 years ago. And if that doesn't make you want to just weep for joy, then you have no idea how deep and strong that sin is. And you can't possibly understand how great God's love for you is. You see, God doesn't see an alcoholic. God doesn't see a drug abuser. God doesn't see someone trapped in sexual addiction. God doesn't see a gossiper. He sees a child of God. He sees his child even more perfectly than you see yours when you look at your kids. Because we look at our kids and we can still see all that, can't we? Sometimes it's right there in our face. That's been removed. Jesus said, as far as east is from the west is how far that has been taken away. So if you're a fill in a blank and you fill that blank in with your sin, it's time for you to realize that you have been consecrated. You've been set apart. And a part of that setting apart is God's work on the cross. Jesus took that away forever. Even the ones that you haven't done yet. The drinks that you haven't drank yet. The nights that you come home drunk again, stoned. Maybe you lost your job. God sees his children. It doesn't mean there's no consequences. We live in consequences. But the process of moving forward through that and becoming what God wants us to be is what consecration is all about. Doing my job as a pilot, it took me about a year to go through Air Force pilot training. It took me 4 more months to learn to fly a specific airplane. And then from then on, for the next, when was that? 1988, 89, I graduated from pilot training. From then on until today, I do periodic retraining. Because when you get on that airplane, you want to make sure that if something goes wrong, there's a guy in that seat that knows what he's doing, right? You don't want me to go, oh no, the engine blew up! No, when the engine blows up, I go, hey, the engine blew up. Because we do that over and over and over again. We practice, right? Sometimes we don't think about that in our Christian lives. But that's what consecration's all about. That's what sanctification is. It's the process of going through life and getting better at it as we go. And we screw it up sometimes, don't we? In the sim, I've crashed the sim a few times, I can tell you that. I've never crashed an actual airplane yet. The other day, a man named Al Haynes passed away at the age of 87. Some of you may have a vague memory of that name. Back in the, I forget the exact date, 1989, 88, somewhere in there, a DC-10 was on approach to Sioux City, Iowa, with no hydraulic power left because they'd hit a flock of birds. Over 300 people on the airplane. Captain Al Haynes was at the controls, which is kind of a euphemism because there were no controls at that point. The DC-10 had a purely hydraulic flight control system, and the hydraulics were gone. Somebody asked him way after, what was the most surprising thing that ever happened to you during that whole entire thing? And he said, you know what it was? The other guy was flying the airplane, and we were about to land, and I told him, I have the airplane, and I put my hands on the yoke. He said, that was the silliest thing I could have said. Yoke didn't do anything. They were flying the airplane by moving the throttles back and forth, pushing left, pushing right, pulling up, pushing down. 187 people survived that crash that day because of Al Haynes, because of the practice that he had done in the simulator, that he crashed a few times. You may crash and burn in your life. I can tell you I have. But that's not the end of the story. You see, we sang a song earlier about my story. My story is about Jesus. It's his story. Because every time I crash and burn, Jesus forgives. And I go, oh God, how could I have been so stupid? How could I have done such an idiotic thing? I knew better. You even reminded me, Lord, at times I do my sins when I know I'm doing something wrong, and I do it anyways. But he forgives. You see, that cross was 2,000 years ago. It didn't happen last week. It covered all of the sins for all people for all time. Consecration, making me more like Christ, is an ongoing process. One of the young men that I counsel struggles with pornography. And he just texted me while I was in Australia, almost at the same time you were texting me. Man, I was having such a great day. He said, I thought I was on top of it. He's an electrician. He said, I just felt the presence of God with me at work. It was so good. And then I got home and I just fell. I didn't even see it coming. And you know what I told him? I said, get up. Maybe get down. Get down on your knees. One of my favorite phrases, get down on your knees and fight like a man. Because it's a process. Consecration isn't a single thing. God doesn't snap his fingers and make you perfect. Well, maybe he did for you. He didn't for me. I can tell you that. It's not about the failures. It's about the process. God loves you. He's slowly making you into the person that he wants you to be. So, the 4 C's of Christian walk. First, creation. You were created to be something, to do something very specific. You are his workmanship. No matter what you look like, how you feel in the morning when you get out of bed, no matter how smart you are, no matter how good you are at your job, you were created for a purpose. Second, commission. You were given a commission. You were given God's authority to do the things that he created you to do, and a command to obey him. Third, a calling. You were given a calling. That's the specifics of your life. Usually you're not going to know what that is right away. That's okay. But that calling is something that everyone has, no matter who you are. And fourth, consecration. There's a process we go through. You see, the consecration in my life makes me a better pilot. How does my faith affect my work as a pilot? It affects me because when another pilot sits beside me on the way to Australia in the middle of the night and says to me, I think my marriage is falling apart. My wife's an alcoholic. I've told her over and over she's got to stop. She needs to go get help. I've said I'd pay for it. I'd take her. I'd go with her, anything. And she won't. She denies it. I think she started seeing another guy. I think she's lawyering up. Maybe I should. What do I tell that guy? What do you tell that guy? You have those people in your life. If there's people in your life, you know their stories, some of them. If you're open to hearing it, they'll tell you things. They'll drop little hints. We don't typically in church, at least in the church that I am in, we don't get up in front and say, my marriage is going to hell in a handbasket. I don't know if I'm going to be married in another 3 weeks. This morning I got myself out of my bed and I hated my wife more than I've ever hated anybody in my life. We don't say that in church, but it's true sometimes. See, it's a process. As a pilot, I get to touch people none of you will ever touch. And as you get to touch people that I'll never see, Pastor Shive will never see, the deacons, the elders, they'll never see them, but you do. You have a message of hope. Hope in the cross. Because all of that stuff's been nailed to it. It's gone, friends. I hope this morning, we've talked about work, you've seen a little bit into what it is that God has for you. I've told you a little bit about what he has for me. I've got tons of stories. Maybe if you stay later, I'll tell you some. God's really got something big for you to do. In fact, it's so big, he planned it before he created the earth. Your job. Go do it. Make it worth it. Walk worthy.